we needed to end on a far more interesting note, perhaps. To discuss these, Alice and I are joined by Richard Griffiths, Head of Media Strategy at Ketchum. Good to see you.
Hello, Cumberland. Good to see you too.
The top story, of course, today, not just in business, but on the current affairs side of the world, is developments in Spain and this referendum. What impact would you think this will have, not just politically, but economically as well?
Well, I mean, this is an extraordinary moment for Spain, and what we saw at the weekend was a direct consequence, if you like, of the economic austerity measures. The regional election in Catalonia was a litmus test of whether Catalonians do want to go it alone, and looking at the results overnight, it's far from clear, really, that Catalonia will remain part of Spain. I mean, there are a couple of challenges, and many challenges, I think, to the pro-independence parties. One is that a referendum would be illegal under the Spanish constitution, so we shouldn't forget that. The other aspect that interests me is if you travel to Catalonia and you talk to businesses in the capital of Catalonia, Barcelona, larger businesses in particular will tell you that you've got to remember that the rest of Spain is the biggest trading partner of Catalonia. And I think this point in the IHT this morning makes exactly that point. Independence would be bad for Catalonia, and it would be bad for Spain. So I think small businesses may take another view, perhaps if you talk to people in the corner shop in parts of Catalonia, but I think large businesses, people who run large businesses, will want to see Catalonia remain part of Spain and not become the 28th member of the European Union.
But sorry, Alice. Well, I'll just say, inevitably, people are going to draw comparisons to what's happening here as well, and in Scotland as well. Do you think that the strength of the argument, this independence argument that we're fighting, is measured along with what's happening economically in Europe? And the worse it gets, the more nationalist movements push this kind of argument.
I think it's absolutely related to economics. The irony with Catalonia, though, of course, is the fact that it's a much richer, it's the richest part of Spain. GDP levels are higher in that part of Spain than in others. But you're absolutely right. As the economics go down, people start to think, could we do things a bit better on our own? But well, I think there are a few challenges ahead, and it'll be interesting to see where this goes. But my money wouldn't be on secession.
And our several analysts, actually, we've been speaking to have drawn a similar point, that actually what's happening in Catalonia at the moment can almost be seen as something of a microcosm for what's happening across the Eurozone. And, of course, our next story in El País again focuses on Spain and its economic woes and layoffs happening in several of the major banks. Yeah, and I think the piece in El País is essentially a reminder, if you like, of the broader economic challenges that have hardened the resolve of Catalans for secession. I mean, this story essentially is about the fact that the banks in Spain that are in particular trouble are the caixas, the regional banks that desperately need recapitalising to stay afloat. And what's happened now is that Spain has finally asked the European Union for money to help them stay afloat. The quid pro quo, of course, from the European Union is, you know, we'll give you this money, but essentially we need to see something back for it, and that's going to mean painful restructuring for those banks, including thousands of job losses to keep the banks afloat. So the story's not over at all. I think, you know, for them to get this money, there's got to be something in return. And I think that the broader story with the Spanish economy and the crisis that we see is not going to go away, and it's going to take some pain, I think, before things get better.
Richard, you emphasize that this is what is happening mainly with regional banks, but isn't it also a reflection of malaise across the banking sector? Because earlier this year, job losses at UBS, Citigroup, and elsewhere.
You're absolutely right. And if you look at the front page of the FT this morning, they're talking about one of the big growth areas is risk management. And why is that? It's because there needs to be more recapitalisation, and there's got to be more of a focus on risk and mitigating risk. And that's one of the few areas in the City of London now that you are seeing a boom. There's not a boom anywhere else, but risk management is where the money is.
Okay, moving on now to the Gulf news, and the Egyptian president defending his emergency decrees amid continuing unrest, and of course the knock-on effect that's now had in share prices across Athens.
That's right. I mean, we saw a big fall in the Egyptian stock market on Sunday. It's interesting, I think, what's happening to President Morsi, because he's gone overnight, almost overnight, from being an international hero, a hero on the international stage, having help secure the peace in Gaza between Israel and Hamas. But on the sort of local stage, he's become a villain within Egypt itself. Why? Because Egyptians think he's becoming too authoritarian. And I think it's interesting that the Gulf News is leading on this story. Gulf News is based in the UAE, and there's a lot of regional interest in what happens in Egypt. His messaging, Morsi's messaging is interesting. He's talked about the need to find common ground with the opposition parties, so it appears to me, from a messaging perspective, he's trying to be a little bit more consensual. And it'll be interesting to see what happens today. He's addressing opposition parties and to see whether some kind of, we managed to see some kind of agreement.
Doesn't it also show just how unpredictable this Arab Spring has been? I mean, you hear that Christian and other liberal groups are withdrawing from the constitutional writing process in Egypt because they feel that the Muslim Brotherhood is trying to push an Islamist agenda. And at the beginning of the Arab Spring, everyone was talking about democracy flourishing and a new openness. And this is exactly the opposite.
Well, and I think you're absolutely right, because if you look at the picture on the front of the Gulf News, we see these protests in Tahrir Square in Cairo, and it's like a repeat of what happened 2 years ago, albeit with a different regime. So, you know, very, very interesting to see how the Arab Spring is playing out, and not in the way that we might have expected.
Let's take a look at the Mail, and really pretty car, quite frankly. Many young men and perhaps middle-aged men dream of an Aston Martin, but the company is denying it. But this report that Mahindra & Mahindra is moving ahead to buy a majority stake in Aston.
You can hear our excitement with this story, can't you? I mean, Aston Martin, one of the great British brands. Of course, most recently it was featured, or the classic DB5 was featured in Skyfall, the latest James Bond movie, and what a car that is. And as you say, the owner of Aston Martin, which is a Q80 fund, is denying that they've had interest from this Indian firm Mahindra & Mahindra. I think the story is a reflection of the fact, if it were to go through, that the markets for cars like the Aston, and we saw this a little bit with Jaguar, are in the emerging markets. They're moving east. Jaguar has talked about opening up a plant in China. And Aston Martin, if this goes through, I think it's a reflection of where the money is. And also, is it maybe a reflection of just how potent and how powerful the Bond brand is to some extent? Hugely powerful. I mean, to actually, if you were working in marketing and you can get your brand in one of the Bond films, I mean, it's bingo. So, a hugely iconic brand, and it'll be interesting to see if Mahindra & Mahindra do manage to push this through.
Richard, we only have like 30 seconds left. What's your take on Boris Becker? And I say Boris Becker, that's what I call him. I'm talking about Boris Johnson, mistaken as Boris Becker, King of England. What do you think?
He's clearly building on the huge upturn we saw in his reputation post the Olympics.
His own brand.
His own brand, and of course the papers are speculating about, you know, whether it's because he wants to become Prime Minister. But it's interesting, isn't it, that in fact very few people in India actually knew him. So,
well, we know you, Richard Griffiths from Catch and Play, and thanks for being with us. And that is our newspaper review. We'll be back with more news in a few minutes.